So I'm Amina Ali. Thank you for that introduction. So my background is before becoming councillor and getting into public life, I was a journalist. I also worked in law and I worked in Parliament as well. And I've held about 3 cabinet positions in cabinet in the local authority. So I've sort of been around the block a bit. I want to really talk a bit about the changes I feel growing up black in Britain. So I'm ethnically Somali, like Abdi, but my experience is very different. So many of you may know that the Somali communities, Abdi also did say, came to the UK as refugees in large numbers in the 90s because of civil war. But there was a community that predated the refugee Somali community, and that's a community I hail from. My family have been here since the 1930s. They were seafarers, which is obviously why the removal of the statue of the Docklands is quite significant to me. They worked on the docks in the East End, they worked in the docks in Liverpool, Cardiff, and they were part of the Black, African and Caribbean hidden community that existed pre-Windrush. That was the communities that were there. So that's where I come from. So my experience very much is growing up in the 70s and the 80s and again 90s. And also, unlike many of the panelists, I'm also parents. So I'll try and talk about the perspective of being a parent to young adults as well. So growing up in the 70s, obviously it was a time when, as many of us know, political correctness did not exist. It was very blatant. Racism was in your face. It was raw. I grew up in the 70s as a young child wanting to be white. I'm sure many black girls did. We saw whiteness as beauty. We all wanted blonde hair and blue eyes. I remember when the film Roots came out, suddenly we saw, for me, that was my first time of understanding what slavery was. I hadn't even known it had existed up to that point. And again, going to school, we were tormented. Africa was seen as a very bad place. There were references to Tarzan, going back to the jungle and all the rest of it. And so that was a very, very harsh time to be black, because everything around us was saying black was bad. And you didn't want to be black. Fast forward to the 80s, the East End, Tower Hamlets was a very white East End. Now the word multicultural didn't exist. It didn't exist in those days. In the 80s, growing up in Tower Hamlets was a very white, working class, raw community. And my school, the black community was small, the Asian community were quite small as well. And so people were very racist. And the majority of racism, unfortunately, was towards the Asian community. The National Front marched through the East End quite a lot, going through Brick Lane and other parts just to attack the Asian community. And the black community and the Asian community were quite in alliance at the time. I mean, I was quite young politically. For me, I didn't know what was going on. I just knew that they were these racist thugs that would march through our borough every once in a while. But behind that, there was a lot of the civil rights movement in Britain going on. A lot of the alliances between the Asian community and the word black becoming very political and engulfing Asians as well as black people. A lot of that was going on at the time. School, again, the usual, where if you went to a poor school, even if you went to, I suppose, a good school, if you're black, you were not expected to go far. I mean, funny enough, lots of my teachers now kind of their jaws drop. The fact that I'm now a counsellor in the very secondary school. I'm a counsellor warden of the very secondary school I went to, where the teachers actually had no hope of someone like me ever becoming a counsellor or doing anything worthwhile. It just didn't exist at all. My old brothers were part of the Brixton riots, so we very much identified ourselves as black. It was black British. There was no Afro-Caribbean, no African. You were just black in the 80s. That was it, hardcore black. And my brothers would go part of the Brixton riots. They took part in that because they were being stopped and searched and all the rest of it. Fast forward to 90s, suddenly political correctness comes along and we're all being given labels. So you're Afro-Caribbean, you're Somali, you're this, you're that, and the segregation and separation within the black community starts in the 90s. And so you had this identity of being black, and then suddenly you're being told, actually, you're not black enough, you're a Somali, you're not really the right kind of black. And on top of that, oh yeah, you've got Islamophobia as well because you're Muslim. So gosh, you know, you're really struggling now, aren't you? Stand over there, please. So all these labels, and you suddenly have this great identity crisis. And I always say that I feel more British or English when I leave England. When people hear you speak and they're like, hey, you're English. And every day you have to answer the question, where are you from? Where do you come from? And in that one question, it's you do not belong here. We all feel it. Everybody on here, I think, has come across that once, twice, even more in their lifetime. It's insulting. It's insulting to our families that live here. It's insulting to us who see ourselves as British. And it's insulting to contribution our ancestors made and that we make on a daily basis. And that's quite difficult. So I'm really angry that I have to now have this conversation. I had in the 80s, I had in the 90s at uni, and suddenly now I'm having it with my young children, my adults children, young adult children, who are going through the same things I went through. And it saddens me because I never thought that, I think in the 90s we lived in a kind of illusion, maybe it was New Labour, I don't know what it was. There was a bit of an illusion that things had moved on a bit, you know, and blacks were doing okay and Asians were doing okay. You know, we're okay. There was a bit of that going on. But the reality is, under the austerity, the inequality that black communities have has really become clear. And one last thing really I want to talk about is Bame. I think the whole Bame acronym is a big problem. We've all been put under one box that we all tick called Bame. We all have very different experiences inside that Bame label. And I think that's become a way for policymakers to become lazy, to not really look at different communities and their different needs. And suddenly also the black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, we are not seen through the lens of class. We don't have a class. So many of us who have done well, who would be seen if we were white as middle class, many of us who would be seen as professional and in terms of social mobility have done very well, we're invisible. We're all seen as people who need saving by some kind of government somehow. And, you know, that's a big problem, I think, with the whole Bame thing, because we're not seen through the lens of class, we're seen the lens of race. So, you know, that's maybe a debate for another day. But that's really it. So again, just really wanted to round up by saying about the statue. So as I said, going back to the beginning, my father was a seafarer, so that statue really was an insult to the slaves, you know, and the slavery industry that was built on the docks of the East End. And I walked past her again today, funny enough, because I wanted just to look around, and I saw, you know, the statue was outside the museum itself, which is an insult because the museum has a really good slavery exhibition inside there. And along there, it was all about the glory of the docks, this glory of this wonderful docks, which is great, but on whose back were those docks built? You know, talk about the sugar story, the sugar slavery, slavery and sugar, and the sugar trade. On whose back? And I think Britain now needs to be ready for a proper raw conversation about race, about where we fit in. And I really want this momentum that started with Black Lives Matter to really make a difference, because I don't want to be here having the same conversation with my grandchildren about this issue. And sadly, it worries me that I will have to have that conversation, because I think Britain has a real problem with race. And unless we really address it properly, it's not going to go away. And we, as a black and ethnic minority communities, we need to also address the issue within our own communities that we have, and then be united in challenging people who don't look like us as well. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.